Good afternoon. My name is John Stoltz, Director of Conferences and Events for APICS, and I will be your host for today's webinar. We're pleased to be joined by Scott Ehrsam, CSCP, from Caterpillar Global Aftermarket Services Division of Caterpillar for today's program, Making It Count, Designing, Executing, and Sustaining Supply Chain Transformations. Scott is a presenter at the upcoming APICS 2017 conference, scheduled for October 15th through 17th in San Antonio, Texas. And we're especially pleased to have him joining us today for a preview of some of the great content that will be featured at the conference. You can learn more about the APICS 2017 conference, including full educational session descriptions, along with special savings for early registration and more at apicsconference.org. Scott is a supply chain manager in Caterpillar's Global Mining Division, where he is responsible for the integration of the Bucyrus service parts supply chain. As a global supply chain professional, Scott has a proven track record of developing and leading lean value stream transformations in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. His experience also includes leadership roles in manufacturing, service parts operations, and product support. Scott is joining us today to share how to design, execute, and sustain supply chain transformations. He'll describe a supply chain transformation framework that illustrates how to confront and overcome common problems when planning and executing large-scale supply chain improvements. In addition, actual business situations will be shared to encourage learning and help prepare participants for their most challenging supply chain transformation goals. Now, before we begin, I'd like to run through a few logistical details with you. At the end of the presentation, we'll plan to save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question, simply type it in the designated box and select Send Question to send your question along at any time during the presentation. Those of you viewing this program in a room with several participants may want to designate one person to type in the questions from your group. And lastly, should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please contact GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted online following the event at apics.org. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today's broadcast, Scott Ehrsam.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you today. I understand there's a few hundred people on the line, so I want to thank you for taking some time here in the middle of the day in the United States and the Americas to invest in your own development. For many people, it's first thing after lunch, so I understand this might not be the most energetic time of the day. So I was thinking before this call, to keep your interest, I could start singing, but I know you don't want me to do that. So instead, I'm going to give you a challenge that at the end of this presentation, as John explained, we are going to have time for questions. And the first three good questions that get asked, if you want to provide me your address, I will mail you a Caterpillar hat. So that's my small challenge and incentive to get some engagement at the end of this session today. Now, the purpose of this presentation is really not to entertain anyone. It's not to recruit anyone. It's not to promote my company, Caterpillar. The purpose is to prepare you, because I believe that all supply chain people on this call are change agents. You are among the most uniquely positioned people in any company to help see big opportunities and to make them a reality. So the presentation and why I'm here today is really to offer my experience and some information to help you on your journey to be supply chain and company leaders. So the agenda that we're going to cover today is, first, we're going to talk about a common supply chain manager dilemma. We're going to review a transformation framework. And finally, we're going to talk about making it count, which is why it all matters. And remember, with the hat at the upper right corner, we do have a small incentive at the end as well. So first, I'd like to share some information about me, mostly because if I'm going to inform you about this topic, it's important that you understand my frame of reference because it's not the same as yours, and that's a good thing. So because at APICS, we can all learn from each other. So I come from a small town in New Jersey where our two greatest claims to fame are, number one, George Washington rode his horse down our main street in the U.S. Revolutionary War. And second, Bruce Springsteen once played at our local high school. As a kid, I kind of thought Springsteen was the much more significant event. But graduating from Purdue later on, I was fortunate to have many job opportunities, but I joined CAT for two reasons. First is I wanted to see the world. And Caterpillar is one of those places where you can see the world and get paid to do it. Second, I wanted to somehow participate in a company that makes a positive impact in the world. And at Caterpillar, we like to say the road to progress begins with a road. So I'm very fortunate to be able to have lived and worked many places in the world and gotten some great experiences in inbound, manufacturing, and outbound supply chain. So it's really part of that perspective that I want to share with you today. So let's talk about a supply chain manager's dilemma. I really wish we were all in a room because I'd like to ask a question, see how many hands would go up, which is how many people on this call have ever managed a supply chain crisis? I would expect that most people, if not everyone, has had a hand in managing a crisis. And why is that? It's mostly because supply chain managers like you and me too often can be firefighters. It's very easy for a supply chain manager, therefore, to focus on incremental change. What's necessary to fix a production shortage, a customer backorder situation, an emergency on inventory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So supply chain managers are very frequently responsible to fix problems. And as a result of fixing problems, sometimes it's hard to focus on the larger business issues. So what we're here to talk about today, though, is transformational change. Because by establishing big and sometimes longer-term objectives, companies can sometimes win by focusing on much more than just incremental improvement. But in order to do that, it really requires establishing a long-term goal and then figuring out what are the individual steps to actually reach that target. And really, a supply chain manager, because of the end-to-end focus, is usually the person that's best positioned in any company to really recognize those opportunities and to lead the execution of those opportunities. So that's all about helping your company win. So we're going to talk about this supply chain transformation model. And first, there are many examples of supply chain and business transformations. As an example, there's integration of acquisitions, there's new product launches, there's ERP systems implementations, there's major lean programs, there's footprint changes, many, many large structural changes, and almost all of them involve supply chain. And of course, pursuing a big opportunity and a big change is a big risk. So my advice first, before taking on any big change, is to answer the following question. Is a major supply chain project needed for my business to win? Sometimes the answer to that question is no. It's just a good idea, but it's not something we really have to do. But if the answer to that question is yes, then obviously it's important to get after it and get after it now because it's important for your company to win. So if the answer to that question is yes, the model that we're going to review today first starts with supply chain strategy. Second goes to what is the business case to make that change. Third, what is an execution model to implement? And then fourth, how do we sustain those changes? Now, of course, there's a piece that's missing in the middle. And at the conference, I'm going to ask, what is that piece that's missing? Some people would say it's people. Some people would say it's the APICS score model. Some people might say it's a little bit of magic and a big prayer. But my assertion to you is the mortar that holds this model together is leadership. So at the end of this presentation, we're going to discuss what I believe is your most important role as a supply chain professional, and that's being a supply chain leader. So before we move further, I also want to ask everyone on the line to please think about your individual company situation and think about a large challenge that's facing your company, what might be required for a major transformation. It could be one of the things on this list. It could be something not on this list. It doesn't matter. But please spend a second and just think, what is a big challenge my company is facing that might require a large-scale supply chain transformation initiative? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple seconds just to think. So I hope everyone has at least one challenge in mind, because I'm going to refer back to that as we go through this meeting today. So first, let's talk about supply chain strategy. Now, strategy is one of those words where there's hundreds of definitions. My simple definition of strategy is, first, where do you want to go and why do you want to go there? It starts with a solid understanding of the problem. What is your burning platform? Second, what is the goal and why is it critical to achieve that goal for your company to win? Third, what is that simple objective to help with your company's vision and mission? How does that help you, as an example, win with your customers? How does it help you win versus your competitors? So we've all been in strategy presentations where it's 25, 35, 45 PowerPoint slides, and people leave the room and leave the meeting, and they have no idea how to concisely explain what is the strategy. So simplicity is very, very important in establishing a strategy. So as we go through the other pieces of this, the keys to success in terms of establishing a strategy are, one, I believe, to take an external perspective. Now, what does that mean? Well, a strategy and a goal is not, as an example, we're going to improve inventory turns 25%. A goal or strategy might be to dominate our industry, we must achieve 4 inventory turns. Or another example might be take an end-to-end focus. So a strategy is not improve supply chain efficiency by 10%. It can be to provide better shareholder returns, we must reduce total supply chain costs by 10%. So having an external perspective and having an end-to-end focus are 2 critical pieces. The third piece is to make it clear and compelling. So I'm going to give you 2 examples at Caterpillar. In our tractor division, we have a very simple strategy and goal. It's called 1-10-100. 1-10-100 means one team to make a tractor in 10 days will help the company succeed for the next 100 years. Now, for anyone on the line working in supply chain, you can see there's supply chain written all around that mission. But the goal is very simple. Another goal is fix, grow, dominate. This is for another division where we make our building construction products. So the first thing is we need to fix our supply chain. The second is we need to grow our business. And the third is we want to dominate our industry. Again, many supply chain initiatives wrapped in there, but a very simple, clear, compelling vision. So that's the last piece, is it has to be compelling. I really like the story, true story, of a granite quarry in northern Italy, and the owner of that quarry one day came out and asked one of his workers, "What's your job?" And the worker replied, "My job is to cut bricks." And the owner of the quarry was very disappointed, so he came out the next day and he led the worker to town where he could see the church that the bricks were helping to build. So the third day he walked out to the quarry and he asked the same worker, "What's your job?" And the worker replied, "My job is to build cathedrals." So as we communicate a vision, we have to make it clear and compelling. We have to make it understandable, and we have to do it in such a way that it engages our teams. So if all that is maybe a little too theoretical, let's get on to some specific examples. So in Caterpillar, we have something called engineered value chains. And to tell you a little bit about an engineered value chain, since 1925, we have a reputation for designing the best machines in the world. But we had one problem. We focused on the value chain and on the supply chain as links. We didn't engineer the chain, we engineered the links. Suppliers, prime product, distribution, etc. As a result of that fragmented approach, we had a weakness in how we did our business, and in 2011 and 2016, we lost over $20 billion of sales opportunities. We were left with high inventory, and we had long cycle times and inconsistent delivery. So it was clear we had to do something because this impacted our employees through layoffs, it impacted our suppliers through lack of trust, it impacted our shareholder returns, and it also impacted our dealers and our customers. So we came up with this approach called engineered value chains. The basic idea of an engineered value chain is it is a market-back approach. It starts with customers, and it goes all the way back to product development. So starting with customers, the key question is, what do they value? And to do deep analytics on what they value and how to provide it to them through the supply chain. And then how do we synchronize the entire supply chain to deliver that value, not more, not less, just what customers want. So after designing that engineered value chain, then we deploy lean. Lean is, in our definition, built-in quality, right part, right time, lead times, and other different initiatives. My very simple definition of lean, for those that have been through APICS, is takt time equals cycle time. We don't do any more than that. We don't do any less than that. We synchronize the value chain to make takt time equal cycle time, and then we try to reduce it. So once we have all those foundational pieces in place, then we pursue other things on end-to-end like S&OP, capacity planning, quality management systems, etc. So in total, that's how engineered value chains at CAT work. And as I said, the key points are, first, we work backwards from the customer. We use an end-to-end focus, implement lean, and then we do foundational processes. At Caterpillar, we've been working on this for about 5 years now. We have about 50% of our value chains covered, and we have a goal to save about $5 billion. We've so far achieved about $2 to $3 billion of that through supply chain savings. A very specific example is in the operations supply chain, where we were looking at steel, and steel from a manufacturer in England going to locations in the Americas, in Asia, and in South and in Africa. And so the problem is that we had a push system, and the push system resulted in long lead times, bad delivery performance, and high inventory. And when demand changed, when demand went down, we were left with very high inventories and very low customer service. So we used the EVC concept to change from push to pull. And as a result of changing from push to pull, we reduced lead times from 16 to 5 weeks, and we improved delivery performance by more than double. And the whole idea was to really take that market-back approach, starting with customers and what did it require back to the engineer's pencil at the front of the supply chain. So that's an example for you about engineered value chains. So next, let's talk about business case. And remember, I promised I was going to come back to your idea for a company challenge. So let's say that you have a strategy. And what's next after you have a strategy? Well, of course, a strategy means nothing unless you have money and investment to implement it. Now, that investment can come in capital, it can come in people, it can come in time, many different ways. But at the end of the day, a great strategy stays a strategy unless you have the funding and the support to implement it. So my contention to you is that a supply chain manager must be able to make the business case to justify that investment. And the keys of making a business case are, number one, on the bottom of the slide. First, you got to get your numbers right. If you don't have your numbers right, nothing else matters. Second is to apply total cost of ownership to your idea, not just on what it does in inventory, not just what it does to transportation costs, but what it does to the entire supply chain. And then last, communicate that business case by the impact on owner value. If you're a publicly traded company, of course, that means shareholder value. If you're a private company, that means owner value. But what does your business case mean in terms of increasing owner value? So an example, as we look at Caterpillar, is we use a model called OPAC. Now, of course, every supply chain manager has to have acronyms. So OPAC for us stands for Operating Improvement After Capital Charge. And the main pieces of OPAC are the operating profit after you've paid the bills, the capital charge, your cost of capital, and what's left. Now, this is not a very complicated idea. We all have OPAC in our own lives. Most of us, if not all of us on the line, make a salary. And most of us on the line, if not all of us, pay rent and interest to the bank. And we have food that we need to pay for. We have basic things that we have to spend every month. Those are your operating expenses. OPAC is simply what money you have left after you've paid your bills. So in the same way that we have a personal OPAC, companies have an OPAC as well. And that extra OPAC is what we return to our owners and our shareholders. So at Caterpillar, we use OPAC. It is an external measure. It does quantify the return to owners. It does enable a comparison across projects. And it also helps comparison of many projects to determine which ones are going to get funding. So an example, as we look at a case study, something I've worked on is the supply chain integration of Bucyrus. It was an unplanned investment. We had a great strategy. We had to make the business case to win a $100 million investment, which we successfully did, to generate more than $300 million of OPAC. And based on that, we won the funding to proceed amongst many good project ideas that also had a positive OPAC. So the main point here is whether you have net present value, ROI, or OPAC, or economic value added, choose the one that you like. To really take the time as a supply chain manager and make that business case, make it accurately, use an external focus, and also do it in such a way that you're clearly explaining what is the value that you can provide to your owners. So after the business case, now we can say congratulations. You have an idea. You have support for funding. Now comes the hard part. The hard part, of course, is the execution. And this is where I think most supply chain managers either win or lose their reputation. You either gain a reputation for someone that can execute or you don't. So it's very important to be able to execute on what you've made your business case to win the approval. So as we look at execution, some of the keys to success are, number one, of course, get the right people on the bus. The second is to get a reputable, visible sponsor, especially for a very large transformation project. Having a senior sponsor is, of course, very critical. I would even go so far as to say, if you don't have a senior sponsor, don't start the project, because chances are it's not going to work because the change management is too complicated to do. Second, it's important to have a very good execution plan. I'm a very big fan of something called slow, slow, fast, fast, which is actually a concept from Japan and Asia, which means that before we move quickly, we're going to do a lot of consensus building and project planning. Some people call that nemawashi, to make sure that we have a plan that everyone agrees to and that we're all aligned. It may take a little bit longer to establish that plan, but once we have that plan and everyone agrees, then we can execute very, very quickly. And then finally, an effective project management cadence is also critical. So let's talk about an example. At Caterpillar, we have an execution model that's built on 5 basic building blocks. The first one is the right people, in terms of having the right people on the bus and having clarity with roles and responsibilities. The second is the processes that are needed to execute. The third is the systems. Do we have multiple ERP systems? How do we communicate with supplier systems? How do we communicate with our logistics systems? What are the systems necessary to make your transformation project work? The third is the data. If we don't have good data, the supply chain transformation doesn't work. And then fourth, effective governance. So these are the 5 building blocks that we use at Caterpillar. So the keys in terms of execution, and there's lots of them, but the ones I like to focus on are, number 1, a very detailed and agreed project management cadence. The second is communication. It's very hard to overdo communication because everyone needs to know what's wanted, why we need to go there, and when. So that communication is very critical. The third is implement in small steps and build from that. And the third one is to recognize the results. Because without that recognition, we're not going to build the added engagement and the enthusiasm to continue with the project. So an example for you, that same one I brought up about supply chain integration. We had a strategy, we formed the team, we got the funding, but when we first started the execution, things didn't work very well. And the reason why they didn't work very well is because we missed something. The thing that we missed is we didn't have a clear and visible sponsor. So we went out and we got one of our top senior executives, and that top senior executive made it a priority, communicated it in many different ways in terms of all employee meetings, letters, videos, you name it. And we were able to drive alignment across 13 different divisions of Caterpillar to be able to execute that program. So I'm not saying that anyone is an expert, myself included, but the thing that we missed is that clear and visible sponsorship. So that's the execution piece. So now let's move on to sustainment. So we're all feeling good. We have a strategy, we've gotten the money, we've executed, but how many of us have been involved in a program where we implement the change, but then we look back 1, 2, or 3 years later, and it's gone right back to how it was before? So sustainment, I think, is one of the key things that typically gets missed, is really making sure that we're taking the right steps to sustain what we've implemented. The keys to success, I think, in sustainment are, number 1, that recognition. But remember, we don't recognize just for the sake of recognition. We don't celebrate activities per share. We celebrate earnings per share. So let's make sure we recognize, but we recognize in successes that add business value. Second, key to sustainment is the governance, including, by the way, leadership development. So there may be a lot of people working on the program. Are we developing leaders as part of that, or are we just telling people what to do? The third piece is effective change management. Now, a lot of people will do good governance. Some supply chain managers will do recognition, but few are good at change management because it's the thing that we sometimes just forget or we don't have the time to do. So at Caterpillar, we have a change management model. Now, to talk about change management, let's get beyond any warm and fuzzy ideas. Change management is not getting everyone in a room and saying we're going to implement something and having them feel good and leave. It's not giving everyone a mug with a logo on it. It's not taking everyone to the ball game and have everyone feel good about a program. Change management is much more scientific and precise. Change management is all about making a map about who you want to change and what you want to change. And then very specifically figuring out who are your change targets. And after you figure out what those change targets are, it's important to communicate the why. It's important to teach the how. It's important to reinforce through celebration. And it's important to establish ongoing ownership, not just from you as the leader, but from them owning the new process, owning the new project, etc. So an example of this is we had an inbound supplier turnaround where we had a big problem. The supplier was a bottleneck both before and after them in the supply chain. It was implementing all kinds, it was causing all kinds of problems with high inventory, low delivery. Everyone was frustrated. So our solution is we had a strategy, we got the funding, we did the execution, we implemented something called CAP production systems, which is a lean approach, kind of like Toyota production systems and other models. At the end of the day, our most important thing with that supplier, though, was to establish ownership. So one of the very conscious things was to make sure that we didn't have just Caterpillar people telling everyone what to do and establishing the program cadence. We made a conscious effort to develop the supplier personnel and also to put those supplier personnel in leadership roles and to provide the recognition through them, not through Caterpillar, such that as time went on in the program, that the program became their program, not a Caterpillar program. So that last piece on the transfer of ownership is very critical, because without that, the chances are that we will come back 1 or 2 or 3 years later and it's going to be just the way it was before we started the change. So as we move on, after sustainment, the last piece is leadership. Now, a personal point of view, and to get something on the table, transformations will not work without effective supply chain leadership. Not a chance it's going to work. So if we want to be a good leader and supply chain leader, we have to place a very clear focus on leadership. And just like many things, there are many definitions of leadership. My personal favorite definition is direction, connection, and credibility. Direction is where are we going and why are we going there? Connection is what is my role in that journey? And finally, credibility is what is your credibility as the leader if I sign up and I put my energy into the program? Are you going to change your mind? Are you going to walk away as the leader? Or are you going to be there when I put myself out to deliver your program? So credibility, which some people describe as just having good personal values. So as we look at leadership, I think the keys to leadership are, number one, clarity. What is the simple vision and the steps to get there? Second, communication. What is a consistent message, not a changing goal every day or every week? What's an inclusive message in terms of what my role is? And am I repeating the same messages to get that consistency? And then finally, climate. Am I creating a positive, productive workplace to actually enable the achievement of my program? Now, some of you may be thinking, I don't agree climate's important. Well, personally, I think climate is important. As you think about your own idea and you think about your own experience, we can do a strategy, we can get funding, we can execute, we can sustain, but the climate is very important to actually achieving the goals that you set out. So at Caterpillar, we have a philosophy that leaders are the first people who are responsible to create the climate to make success. A few years ago, the Hay Group in Harvard University did a study of over 50 companies, and they made a big discovery. Their discovery was that better work climates generate better financial results. Now, I'm sure that that's not a surprise to anyone on this phone, but I want you to think about for a second the times in your career that you enjoyed a program or a project the most. I would guess with you that those times when you enjoyed that project was probably working with people that you trusted, and you worked really hard and you got something really good done. So it's very hard to argue that the work climate doesn't matter. The key thing is, how do you establish that climate? And first, it is important to understand that a constructive climate does outperform one that's not. Second, the leader really does determine the climate. And the most important thing is, what is the leadership style that's necessary to choose that climate? In some situations, you may use a directive leadership style because it's a very high priority emergency situation. In some situations, it may be a very participative leadership style because you need to build consensus and you want to get an inclusive approach with everyone's idea. So very consciously choose what is the leadership style that's necessary in the situation you have to help your program succeed. And last, climate is one of your legacies as a leader. When someone says 3 years later, what is it like to work for John? What is it like to work for Mary? What is it like to work for Joe? What is it you want that person to say? Do you want that person to say, well, they were nice people, but we really didn't get anything good done? Do you want them to say, well, they were really clear as a leader, and they really helped the team work together, and we got great things done, and I would work for them again? What is it that you want those people to say? That's part of your legacy as a supply chain leader. So at Caterpillar, an example is we had an operations supply chain, again, one that I worked on. This happened to be in England, where it was a parts distribution facility. And the very first day on the job, or excuse me, the very first week on the job, we not only had a bad performance in the facility, but we had a cave-in with the office roof. We had some protesters that were from that showed out outside our main facility gates because at that time we were making machines that were being used in Palestine. We had some gypsies show up on our front lawn that started throwing stones at employees' cars driving by. It was a really tough situation. When I was walking into the facility one day, one of the employees said, "Scott, when did the locusts arrive?" And so we had a very bad operational situation, and we had a very bad climate. We had a situation where people at the facility thought, there's no way we're ever going to get better. And we went through all the steps that I've described in this presentation. We had a strategy. We got the business case for the funding. We did execution. We did the sustainment. But we also very clearly focused on the climate, because the climate was important because it was a lot of work, and we had to make sure we generated a positive culture to make sure that the change was going to work. So we very consciously did things like all employee meetings, recognition of some of the best results, all employee events where employees brought their families into the facility. We did a lot of things to establish ownership and to have a positive climate. And I'm convinced that that positive climate was one of the main reasons that the transformation worked. We achieved all of our goals and then some. So leaders really do create the climate for success. Okay, so now let's move into a summary. We've been through a lot of information, but in this presentation we've talked about the key points about strategy. First, establishing a clear and compelling vision. We've spoken about the business case, OPAC, economic value added, your own measure. We've talked about disciplined execution for plan, communicate, and implement. We've talked about the sustainment, meaning the governance and the change management. And finally, we've talked about the piece that holds it all together, which is leadership. Now, this is a lot of work. So you may be asking yourselves, I may have a good idea for something I want to do at my company, but wow, this is a big risk. You know, it's a lot of work. Why do I want to do this? What's the payoff to really do this work? And I would answer that question with the following chart, that the payoff to do it is really enabling your company's success, because by enabling higher shareholder returns, you will attract more investors and lenders. You will help your customers and pursue growth. You will help create employee opportunities. And this is the circle that every successful company will go through. So if you have a major transformation that's needed for your company to win, then you as a leader can make that happen. And you as a leader can help your company win. And by doing that, you're going to help your company not only win, but you're also going to help establish your own legacy as a supply chain leader and as a company leader. So what this is all about is really your own personal decision as you prepare for what I hope are some of these challenges in your career. And I really hope that one day when you have this opportunity to identify or to lead a major transformation, that this presentation will help just a little bit in terms of giving you some of those tools. And I wish you all the success in doing that. So with that, John, I think we're done and we can open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Really outstanding content that you shared. Now we'd like to give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask any additional questions that you may have. As a reminder, click on the Q&A tab on the side of your screen, enter your question, and then click Ask. We'll now give you just a moment to send in any additional questions. Okay, Scott, let's start with this one. During the engineered value chain execution process, how did the organization validate the savings and ensure that they were, quote, real savings?
Yeah, really good question, because that gets to, first of all, the business case. So whoever answered that question, you get awarded the first hat. If you want to send me an email, and I'll get that hat to you. So here's the answer to the question, is that we looked at all of the inefficiencies that we had from the previous 5 years, and we asked ourselves if we were able to fill all of the lost customer orders, if we were able to achieve a competitive inventory turn, if we were able to generate OPAC off of those types of improvements, what would that OPAC have been? So we basically said, if we had our supply chain operating efficiently, what would the incremental OPAC to Caterpillar be? And based on using that number, we said, wow, that's a lot of money. And therefore, what level of investment is necessary to achieve that, that transformation? So that's how we actually made the business case to implement the engineered value chains, was through those potential savings and what they could enable for further OPAC.
Great, thanks. Next question. Regarding your statement about putting a process in place and then realizing a few years later that it's back to the way it used to be, what do you have in place to prevent that from occurring?
Yeah. So again, a good question. So that's hat number 2. Again, if you want to send me the your address. So yes, very, very difficult to do. My best advice is when you're in execution is to already look ahead at what is necessary for sustainment, because it's not good enough just to reach the top of the mountain. How do you stay there? So my advice is to have a clear strategy for sustainment and change management, because frequently you might have some people that even after all the training, don't want to get with the program, it may be necessary to remove those people. It may be necessary to promote other people to assume leadership roles. It may be necessary to make sure that you're developing leaders. So it's hard to figure out the specific answer to your individual situation. So my best advice is to have a very clear sustainment and change management approach where you not only have change targets, but the other thing that I would add is to have clear goals in place, and there's recognition and rewards for those goals even after the project is finished. So maybe just as a quick example, if we have a goal that we're going to improve turns by 20%, and we've made that goal, great, we're going to celebrate. But what is everyone's goals for the next year? Do they include sustaining that and making it better? And is someone's personal performance evaluation based on that, or is it not? So maybe one other piece of advice is to reflect it in people's annual goals as part of that change management model.
Great. Next question. In your opinion, Scott, what is the biggest barrier to effective supply chain transformation, and then how can it be overcome?
Really good question, and that's hat number 3 and the third and last hat. So that's an excellent question. Here's my answer. I think the biggest barrier is usually the supply chain manager, him or herself. What I frequently find is that many supply chain managers recognize a change that needs to happen, but either they don't know how to make the case or they don't want to make the case. And so I think the biggest change and the biggest way to overcome that obstacle is, as we explained in the presentation, is for a supply chain manager not only to recognize it, but also to say, hey, this is really important for my company to win in our industry. And then to take the steps that we've described in this presentation plus more to actually take that career risk in some cases, go to your senior management, make your business case, and start the wheel turning. Now, I specifically said the supply chain manager. I guess second place I could have said the senior leader, but a lot of times senior leaders in companies may not know what you know. They may not understand what you understand. They may need to see your idea and your business case. And so that's why I settled on the supply chain manager. As we said at the beginning, the supply chain manager is frequently the most uniquely and best positioned person in any organization to see the inefficiencies and to see the opportunities, and then to put their strategy and business case together.
Great. Next question. In regards to measuring the impact and results of a supply chain transformation, how often should you review after the implementation in order to make sure you did what you planned and to sustain the transformative efforts?
Okay. So that comes back to the governance model. In terms of measuring, I guess, in terms of my personal experience, if it's a major program, a big investment for any number of reasons, my view is that during the transformation as well as after the transformation, it's very, very important to be at a minimum on a monthly governance cadence. And that monthly governance cadence needs to not only have operational metrics, not only that, but engagement metrics if you can get them, but also the financial metrics. So during the transformation, are we on budget or not? If we are, great. If we're not, why not? And what's our plan? What kind of savings are we generating, again, versus our plan? But then afterwards, to your question, continuing that cadence to say, hey, we may be all done, but let's make sure we're still producing at least a high-level dashboard on what financially this project is delivering, such that our senior leaders can understand that this is not only a one-time execution with savings, it's an ongoing annuity. And that ongoing annuity can continue to pay benefits. And by having that monthly governance and that monthly metrics, especially for the financial side, we can help our senior leaders understand that this is something that we want to keep going.
Great. And then I guess somewhat of a follow-up to that then as well, Scott. This question comes in. Of all the supply chain tools available, what tools specifically do you find yourself using most consistently?
Okay, so I got to think about that one for a second, John, because it's a hard one to, I use all of them.
And maybe focusing on the that kind of continued measurement, if you will, or how do you make sure that you're staying on track?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer that I'm going to give is really in the current job that I'm in, and maybe to set the stage for this is all about the integration of your Cyrus supply chain into Caterpillar. To set the stage, again, this involves 500 to 1,000 people, 13 different divisions, a large level of investment. I think everyone on the line recalls the example. I spend the largest amount of time on my job, not on a monthly metric report, not on a project management cadence. I do those things, but the largest amount of time is on change management. And the reason that the largest amount of time I spend on change management is because we're dealing with such a large and diverse group of people functionally, engineering, manufacturing, purchasing, Caterpillar dealers, the entire value chain, that in order to execute, the communication and the change in management that goes along with that execution is by far the biggest challenge. So in my job, I guess the tool that I use most consistently is change management. And again, that can take many forms just to make sure that we are achieving the alignment that's necessary to actually execute on the program.
Great. Just a couple more questions here, Scott, so that we have time for. As you said, this is a huge amount of work to do effectively. So this individual says, we have a small group of part-time people responsible for driving lean in a supply chain organization. With limited resources, how do you recommend expediting the capability building?
Okay, well, my best experience with capability building is, especially with the lean transformation, is to do a couple things. And maybe these are things that the questioner has already done, but just to review them. Number one is going through this model, make sure that there's a very clear goal and clear strategy. That clarity is just absolutely critical. So again, what are we trying to do? Why are we doing it? And what's my role? Make sure that that end objective is very, very clearly in mind. And then the second piece is once we know and all understand what that clear objective is and why we need to get there and what our role is, then what do we need to do with each person on the team to enable them to actually contribute towards that? Maybe we have some people that are good at takt time, cycle time lean. Maybe we have people that are good at quality lean. But do we have people that have all of the lean tools that are needed for them to contribute to the program? And if we don't, let's offer targeted training, whether that's through mentoring, whether that's through an online course, whether that's the leader getting everyone in a room to say, hey, I've got subject matter expertise in this. Let me share my experience. So that kind of targeted training, especially in a smaller team, I find works very effectively because it's specifically targeted on the gaps that are necessary to reach the mission, not an overall training program that's going to do a lot of things, but again, very targeted training that people usually appreciate because they can put it immediately into practice. And therefore, usually the engagement in that is very, very high. And then the last piece is that after, or maybe even during that training happening, make sure that there's some reinforcement. You know, go up after the class or after the coaching and either informally or formally find opportunities for that individual to not only demonstrate, but recognize them for it. Recognize the fact that they learn a new skill. Reinforce the fact that they're doing more towards contributing towards that program.
Great, thanks. And then one last question. How do supply chain transformation projects handle the rapid pace of innovation?
Okay, so as an example, a rapid pace of innovation might be ERP, SAP, Oracle, or whatever. That's usually the most common area where that question gets asked. But it also could be digital supply chain, could be a lot of areas. My advice is that when we have a large-scale transformation, break it down into pieces that are 6 months or less. Probably like most people on this call, I find that large programs that span years usually don't work. And they don't work for several reasons. The industry changes, competition changes, technology changes, the leaders change, etc. And focus gets lost. It's just a fact of modern business. So if we have a large-scale program, even if it does span over years, let's break it down into phases and 6 months or less. And let's have, as a conscious effort at the end of each phase, re-examination of the original goals, celebration of what was achieved, and then if we need to, recalibrate what we're going to do for that next phase. So let's not overwhelm everyone that we're going to do objectives and we're going to do it for the next 3 years, because that's just way too much. And so breaking it down into the smaller pieces or plateaus, kind of like climbing a mountain, is something that's usually effective with those big programs.
Great, thank you. And again, that's all the time we have for today. We'd like to thank our speaker, Scott Ehrsam, for his time and great insights. We want to thank everyone on the call for joining us. We do hope that you can join us in San Antonio for APICS 2017 in October. We're especially excited that Scott will be again presenting at this year's conference on a very in the now topic, Twitter, trade, and taxes, supply chain agility in a new era of economic nationalism. So we look forward to learning about that and much more at the conference, and invite you to visit apicsconference.org for more information. All content and materials included in this APICS online event are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. This concludes today's APICS online event. Thank you for participating.